Ma'am, I need to know exactly what happened here, all right?
Officer, she just sat down. We were waiting for the bus. She didn't do anything.
I hear you. I just need her side of things.
I told you, I don't know that man who was yelling. He scared me, so I moved over here.
Okay, you're safe now.
Willow Creek Park sits on the edge of the city's wealthiest residential area. A meticulously manicured green space. Wide stretches of emerald green lawns are neatly mowed. Willow trees droop over the slow-flowing stream, its surface reflecting the midday sun like a tranquil mirror. A winding stone path encircles the central lake, a popular spot for leisurely afternoon strolls. This public land, maintained by city taxes, is open to everyone, regardless of who they are or where they come from. It was a Thursday. Precisely 1:15 p.m. The sky was a dazzling blue, cloudless. The temperature was a rare 72 degrees Fahrenheit. A gentle, calming weather that seemed to slow everything down. The park was almost deserted. In the distance, a woman sat reading on a bench. On the lakeside path, a few joggers passed by and disappeared behind the trees. Under the shade of an ancient oak tree near the water's edge, an elderly couple spread out a picnic blanket. They played no music. They didn't laugh loudly. They didn't draw attention in any way. On the blanket lay a neatly arranged basket of food, fresh fruit, sandwiches, and a few bottles of sparkling soda. They sat close together, eating and chatting softly, occasionally chuckling as they recalled old memories. The woman wore a bright linen dress and a wide-brimmed sun hat. The man beside her wore a neat polo shirt and crisp khaki pants. They looked like any successful couple enjoying a peaceful afternoon after years of busy work. No one in the park noticed them, and there was no reason to. At that moment, there was no sign that this tranquility was about to be shattered. No one could have imagined that in less than an hour, this tranquil lawn would become the scene of one of the most serious abuses of power the city had ever faced. The woman sitting on that picnic blanket is Eleanor Mathis, and at first glance, no one could guess who she is. She carries no power, no insignia, no entourage. Just a black woman in her 60s, having lunch with her husband in a public park in the middle of the workday. But behind that unassuming exterior lies a career that commands the respect of the entire federal justice system. For 12 years, Eleanor Mathis sat on the federal judge's bench, where each decision could change the lives of dozens of people. Before that, she spent nearly a decade as a federal prosecutor, directly prosecuting organized crime gangs, human trafficking rings, and interstate drug trafficking networks. In the Western District legal community, her name is synonymous with iron discipline, sharp intellect, and an almost absolute understanding of the Constitution. Eleanor is renowned not for her impulsiveness or domineering power, but for her cool, composed demeanor. She didn't need to raise her voice to command the courtroom. A simple lowering of her tone was enough to silence the entire room. Lawyers who had faced her understood that when Eleanor Mathis spoke, she spoke from the law. And the law never compromises. But that afternoon, Eleanor wasn't in the courtroom. She wasn't wearing her judge's robe. She was celebrating her 30th wedding anniversary, a rare milestone where both she and her husband had decided to set aside their work to dedicate themselves entirely to each other. The man sitting beside her was Marcus Mathis, her husband, a surgeon who had spent over 40 years in medicine. His hands had saved thousands of patients. And like his wife, he had learned to survive and thrive in a society that didn't always treat people like them fairly. That day, they weren't seeking attention, weren't seeking privilege. They simply wanted a peaceful lunch, in the sunshine, like two ordinary people. From her house across the park entrance, Brenda Holloway stood by the large living room window, phone in hand. her gaze fixed on the outside. At 52, Brenda considered herself the guardian of order in Willow Creek. She was president of the Homeowners Association, a position she held with almost absolute zeal. In Brenda's mind, upholding neighborhood norms was not just a responsibility, but a power. From her vantage point, Brenda watched the luxury car pull up near the park. She watched the couple get out, open the trunk, and take out a picnic basket. She watched them walk toward the oak tree near the water's edge, spread out a blanket, and sit down. There was no arguing, no loud music, no behavior that could be called disruptive. But in Brenda, a vague unease began to form. She didn't recognize them. And for Brenda, that was enough to be a problem. In her mind, this park, though public on paper, was actually an extension of the Willow Creek residential area. Outsiders could walk through, but they shouldn't stay, much less occupy the best spot near the water in broad daylight. They looked too relaxed, too natural, as if they belonged there. Brenda stood there for nearly 10 minutes, her frustration growing with each passing moment. Why weren't they somewhere else? Why weren't they at work at this hour? Why were they sitting right there? Finally, she picked up her phone and dialed the familiar non-emergency police line, a number already saved in her contacts. Officer Oakidge. Speaking, Brenda said in a low voice, but unable to hide her tension. She said there were 2 people loitering in the park, that they looked suspicious, that they made her feel unsafe. When the operator asked if they were threatening anyone or causing any trouble, Brenda hesitated for a second before replying that they were just sitting there, looking toward the houses across the street. I think they might be scouting the house, she said, more confidently than was actually possible. The call was recorded. A suspicious person code was entered into the system, and from that moment, a peaceful picnic had officially turned into a police incident, simply because someone believed a black couple didn't belong where they were sitting. The call went through the system, and just minutes later, it appeared on the computer screen in Officer Kyle Vance's patrol car. Vance was parked on the side of the road less than 2 miles from Willow Creek Park. Engine idling. Radio silent. His midday shift was always the most boring time of his life. No accidents. No chases. No action. The text on the screen immediately caught Vance's attention. Suspicious persons loitering near residential area. Possible casing homes. He glanced at the note below where the dispatcher had carefully added that the caller was a resident who frequently complained about unfounded things. Vance didn't read it carefully. Or rather, he chose not to read it. In his head, the story was complete with just a few keywords: wealthy neighborhood, strangers, suspicious. Kyle Vance was the kind of officer who always believed his intuition was more important than procedure. In his 6 years in uniform, he had amassed a record that many believed should have ended his career long ago. 14 internal complaints, most concerning aggressive behavior, 2 unfounded searches, 3 racially motivated profiling allegations. Superiors had reprimanded him, sent him to de-escalation courses, and warned him repeatedly. But Vance remained, protected by the union and a system that valued quotas more than people. He shifted gears, pressed the accelerator, and the patrol car sped toward the park. All the way, Vance didn't consider the possibility that the call might be unfounded. He wasn't prepared for a gentle approach or a simple explanation. In his mind, the mission was clear: eliminate those who didn't belong there. Upon arriving at Willow Creek Park, Vance didn't park in the designated guest parking space. He steered, letting the wheels climb onto the green lawn, stopping in the most visible spot. An action unnecessary from a professional standpoint, but very clear in its message. This wasn't a greeting. This was a display of power. Stepping out of the car, Kyle Vance adjusted his work belt, straightened his bulletproof vest, and adjusted his sunglasses on his nose. He was a large, muscular man, honed more by gym workouts than training grounds. Each step he took toward the oak tree carried a tense energy, not professional vigilance, but a pre-planned aggression. The park was almost deserted. In the distance, a woman sat reading on a bench. A few joggers hurried past on the lakeside path. In front of him, under the shade of a tree, the elderly couple sat on a blanket, completely unaware that they had become the subjects of a scenario they hadn't written. Marcus was the first to notice the police. He gently touched his wife's hand. "Ellie, there are police." Eleanor looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. She saw the officer approaching, his eyes quickly scanning the food basket, the water bottle, the neatly arranged hardcover books. She remained seated, her back straight. The calm demeanor of someone all too familiar with such scrutinizing gazes. Kyle Vance stopped a few steps from the blanket. He didn't greet her. He didn't introduce himself or explain his approach. Instead, he spoke in a loud, dry, and cold voice. Loud enough for those around to hear. "Do you two live here?" Eleanor didn't react immediately. She set her glass of water down slowly, deliberately, then looked directly at Vance. "Hello, officer," she said, her voice calm, without any hint of defensiveness. "What is it?" That answer, instead of easing the tension, ignited a fire. Kyle Vance took another step. "Show me your identification." No explanation. No specific question. Just an order. Marcus instinctively reached for his wallet, a reflex honed over years of learning to avoid trouble. But Eleanor gently placed her hand on her husband's arm, signaling him to stop. She looked up at the officer, her gaze sharp but not provocative. "We're having lunch in a public park," Eleanor said. "We're not causing any trouble or breaking the law. If you can't raise a reasonable suspicion of a crime, we're not obligated to show our papers." The atmosphere instantly changed. On Kyle Vance's face, the initial confidence gave way to anger at being refused. He wasn't used to being refused, and even less so when it came from a woman of color sitting at his feet, speaking to him as if the law still existed. Kyle Vance clenched his jaw, the knuckles protruding beneath the taut skin. He wasn't used to hearing such words, much less when they were spoken in such a calm, precise, fearless tone. In his mind, this approach should have ended with submission, not a constitutional lesson right there on the lawn. "I received a call about suspicious activity," Vance replied, his voice higher than before, carrying unconcealed irritation. "You two are sitting here in broad daylight, looking toward the residential area. This park is primarily for local residents. If you don't live here, you're trespassing." Eleanor looked up, her eyes fixed on the officer's face. "That's not true," she said, slowly, clearly. "This is Willow Creek Park, city property, managed by the Department of Parks and Recreation. The park is open to the public from dawn to dusk. There are no regulations requiring residency, and having lunch here doesn't constitute loitering." Her reasoning was sharp. Not a single word, superfluous. But to Kyle Vance, logic didn't matter. All he felt was a loss of control. He took another step, stepping directly on the edge of the blanket, soiling the corner of the fabric and some of the food. "I don't care where you read the law," he snarled, When I ask for your papers, you have to show them. You're acting suspiciously. And refusing to cooperate is obstructing a law enforcement officer. Marcus leaned forward, trying to keep his voice calm. Officer, we're just celebrating our wedding anniversary. We don't want to cause trouble. I'm not asking about your personal matters. Vance interrupted, pointing his finger directly at Marcus's face. Stand still. Hands where I can see them. In that moment, the exchange transcended the boundaries of a civil inspection. It was no longer a matter of the park or paperwork. It became a pure confrontation between the law and the ego of a badge holder, between civic rights and the need to assert the authority of a police officer who had already decided that he could not be accused of wrongdoing. Eleanor Matisse recognized the moment vividly, the moment when reason ceased to be an effective tool. She had seen it many times in the courtroom, when a defendant stopped listening to their lawyer and began to act on emotion. But this time, the one who lost control wasn't a handcuffed man before the judge. It was the man standing before her, armed with a gun, a badge, and the coercive power of the state. Eleanor slowly rose, not abruptly, not defiantly. Every movement was slow, deliberate, as if she were trying to cool a raging fire. At that height, she was still shorter than the officer, but her demeanor made that distance seem to disappear. Officer, she said, her voice lower, firmer than before. You are very close to committing a grave violation of our civil rights. She reached for the handbag beside the blanket. A clear, pre-announced gesture. I'll get my papers. I suggest you observe carefully before taking any further action. Don't reach for anything, Kyle Vance yelled, his hand sliding down near his gun holster, the safety catch already released. His voice echoed through the quiet park, drawing the attention of those around him. A jogger stopped. A dog walker pulled out their phone. I'm telling you who I am. Eleanor continued, unwavering. I am Federal Judge Eleanor Mathis. My husband is a surgeon. You have no legal basis to keep us here. Kyle Vance chuckled. A short, dry, and contemptuous laugh. Federal judge, he said. Yeah. Sure. I hear that all the time. Do you think I'm stupid? He leaned forward, his eyes cold. You always have your stories. Then he uttered words that froze the air. You people. Those two words hung suspended in the park, heavy and toxic. Marcus clenched his fists. But Eleanor kept her gaze fixed on the officer. She understood that. From that moment on, things had gone beyond a personal mistake. This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was raw prejudice, masked by insignia and authority. And it was about to unleash its consequences. The moment those two words were uttered, Eleanor Matisse understood that the path to dialogue had ended. No more rules. No more reason. Only brute force seeking to assert itself. Kyle Vance strode straight into her personal space, his breath heavy with coffee and anger. I am giving a legitimate order. He snarled. Turn around. Put your hands behind your back. You are under arrest for trespassing and disobedience. I am not resisting, Eleanor said loudly. Loud enough for those around to hear. I am protesting the legality of this order. You have no basis for it. But her words no longer reached him. Kyle Vance grabbed Eleanor's arm, not with the guiding grip of a professional officer, but with the brute force of someone out of control. She staggered, her balance shattered. Stop. Marcus lunged forward. You're hurting my wife. Before the words were even finished, Vance spun around, using his other hand to shove Marcus forcefully into the oak tree behind him. The impact was strong enough to send the older man to his knees for a moment. "Back off," Vance yelled. "Back off. Or you'll follow her." "Don't touch my husband," Eleanor cried, as pain shot through her shoulder and arm. "Officer, you're assaulting a federal judge. Stop immediately." But instead of stopping, Vance tightened his grip. He twisted her arms behind her back, bending her wrists upwards. The pain forced Eleanor to grit her teeth. A sharp clang of metal. Click. Then another click. In the park's momentary silence, the sound of the handcuffs was a cold declaration. Eleanor Mathissa, the woman who had signed the FBI's arrest warrant, who had sentenced international crime bosses, now stood there, handcuffed in broad daylight, before strangers filming. Kyle Vance didn't stop. He turned to Marcus. "You too," he said, obstructing a law enforcement officer. Marcus raised his hands, his voice trembling with suppressed anger. "I was just watching you assault my wife." But Vance didn't listen. He spun Marcus around, pushed him against the tree, and hastily handcuffed him under the oak tree. The 30-year wedding anniversary picnic lay in the dust, fruit scattered on the grass. The blanket trampled. A judge and a doctor stood there, handcuffed like criminals. While the policeman was convinced he had just restored order, Eleanor took a deep breath, then whispered, almost to herself, "You've just ruined your career." Kyle Vance didn't reply. He was too lost in his illusion of power to realize the real storm had only just begun. The patrol car sped out of the park with aggressive acceleration. In the cramped back seat, Eleanor and Marcus sat huddled together, their hands cuffed behind their backs, sweat soaking their shirts. The plastic door slammed shut like a cage. Kyle Vance didn't ask if they were injured, nor did he fasten their seatbelts. He simply said, his condescending tone echoing from the front seat, "If you had cooperated from the start, this wouldn't have happened. In Oakridge, we have order." Eleanor didn't reply. She stared at the metal grill in front of her, memorizing every word, every turn, every number displayed on the speedometer. Marcus whispered if her shoulder hurt. She nodded slightly. They both understood that arguing now would only make things worse. 15 minutes later, the car pulled into the police station's parking garage. The iron gate slammed shut, the sound reverberating in the enclosed space. Vance opened the back door, yanking it open. "Get out." He led them down the concrete corridor, where security cameras hung densely, the cold fluorescent lights reflecting off the floor. At the reception desk, Sergeant Thomas Miller looked up from his logbook. He was a man of 30 years, familiar with most of the city's powerful faces. His gaze swept over Vance, then settled on the two handcuffed men. He froze. His coffee cup hung suspended in midair. He recognized her instantly. That face, those eyes he had stood before her in a federal court hearing 3 years ago. His stomach tightened. "Vance?" Miller said, his voice unusually low. "Who are you bringing in?" "Treason. Refusal to show identification. Resistance." Vance replied, tossing the papers onto the counter. "They even fabricated a story that this woman is a federal judge." He scoffed. Sergeant Miller didn't smile. He stepped away from the counter and approached Eleanor. "Madam," he said slowly, as if afraid of his own words. "Are you?" "Judge Mathis." Eleanor looked up. "I am Federal Judge Eleanor Mathis. I was arrested while having lunch in a public park." The room fell into absolute silence. The air seemed to drain away. Kyle Vance stood frozen, his smile gone. In that moment, the truth wasn't just spoken, It crashed down. Heavy. Undeniable. And everything began to change. Sergeant Miller didn't hesitate for another second. He spun around. His voice low but sharp as a knife. Unclipped the handcuffs. Now, Kyle Vance stood frozen, as if he hadn't understood what he'd just heard. "Sarge, they won't cooperate." I said, "Unclip the handcuffs." Miller interrupted, holding out his hand. "Give me the keys." Miller removed Eleanor's handcuffs himself first. When her hands were brought forward, the deep, dark red marks on her wrists were clearly visible under the fluorescent lights. Marcus immediately stepped closer, anxiously looking at his wife's shoulder. "Are you hurt?" Judge Miller asked, his voice having lost its usual firmness. "My shoulder is twisted." Eleanor replied curtly, "I want to be examined, and I want all the cameras sealed." Miller nodded immediately. "Body cam, dash cam, lobby and garage cameras, all will be sealed." He turned to another officer. "Call Chief Danton. Now." Less than 10 minutes later, Chief Robert Danton appeared, his vest still unbuttoned, breathing heavily. He saw Eleanor sitting in Miller's office, an ice pack on her arm. Marcus beside her. His face turned pale. "Judge Mathissa." "I. Robert." Eleanor interrupted, her voice calm to the point of being cold. "Your officer arrested me because of the color of my skin. In a public park. He used force. Called us you people. And fabricated charges. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a civil rights violation." Danton didn't argue. He demanded to see the body camera footage immediately. The screen switched on. Each second passed in heavy silence. Aggressive approach. Unfounded orders. Racist remarks. The twisting of the wrists. The sound of handcuffs. There was no justification. Danton stood up. He walked straight to the conference room, where Kyle Vance sat waiting, his face ashen. "Stand up." Danton said, "Put your badge, gun, and ID card on the table." Vance's hands trembled as he removed badge number 492. The metal clanged heavily against the table. "You are suspended immediately, without pay, pending dismissal, and you are under criminal investigation for assault and civil deprivation." Kyle Vance was speechless. In less than an hour, the power that had once made him so arrogant in the park had completely crumbled. Right in the place he believed to be safest, his police station. Things happened faster than anyone could have imagined. Just hours later, the body camera and security footage began circulating internally. Then, beyond the police station. By that evening, it was on local news. The next morning, the whole city knew. The image of a federal judge handcuffed in a public park became symbolic of a nagging question many had been asking for years: who is truly protected by the law, and who is not? The FBI's Civil Rights Division launched an investigation the very next day. It targeted not only Kyle Vance's actions, but also a chain of systemic failures from ignoring numerous prior complaints to the department's biased handling of suspect calls. What had been hidden in internal records was now brought to light. Line by line, Brenda Holloway, who had made the initial call, was no longer uninvolved. The recording of her phone call was released under public records law. Her trembling but assertive voice. Phrases like, "They don't belong here, and they make me feel unsafe," were played repeatedly. The community quickly realized it wasn't fear, but exclusion. Brenda lost her position as HOA chair, was ostracized by her neighbors, and faced a civil lawsuit for emotional and defamation damage. The city of Oak Ridge didn't choose to drag it out. Just months later, They agreed to a $6.5 million settlement in the civil rights lawsuit, the largest settlement in the city's history. Kyle Vance was officially fired. His police license permanently revoked by the state. He faced criminal charges of assault and abuse of power, charges that would follow him for the rest of his life. But for Eleanor and Marcus Mathis, all of that couldn't erase the simple truth in just one ordinary afternoon. They had been stripped of their dignity, in the very place where they should have been safest. And this story, despite its clear consequences, is far from over. A year after that day, Eleanor and Marcus Mathis returned to Willow Creek Park. It was still a gentle afternoon. The sky was still a clear blue, and the same old oak tree stood by the slow-flowing stream. They spread out a new blanket, opened their familiar picnic basket, and ate the same simple food as before. No cameras, no newspapers, just the quiet they should have enjoyed from the beginning. A young officer on patrol walked by. He saw them, nodded slightly, and touched the brim of his cap. "Good afternoon. Nice day." Then he continued on his way. No questions, no request for papers, no scrutinizing glances. Just a small moment, but one heavy with meaning. It was an image of something that should have been ordinary, yet so rare that it became a victory. Eleanor watched the officer disappear behind the trees. She didn't smile, not out of bitterness, but because she understood what had changed everything. It wasn't a sudden surge of morality, not instantaneous enlightenment. It was because this time, the person handcuffed was a federal judge, someone powerful enough to force the system to listen. She turned to her husband, her voice low. "Marcus," she whispered, "what if I hadn't been a judge that day? If I had been a teacher, a nurse, or just an anonymous woman of color having lunch in the park? Would the handcuffs have been removed so quickly? Would the sheriff have shown up within 10 minutes? Or would I have been sitting in jail, facing a vague indictment, just to be allowed home?" This story ends with justice, but it's conditional justice. It only appears when the victim is strong enough to demand it. And that's the problem. In a fair society, no one needs to be a federal judge to be treated like a human being. How many other Kyle Vances are still wearing that badge out there? How many Brendas Holloway are still standing behind windows, making phone calls for people who don't belong here? And how many innocent people have been denied the chance to tell their stories, simply because they lack a position of authority to protect them? If this story makes you stop and think, please share it. Please talk about it. Because light only shines when someone dares to turn it on. And justice only has meaning when it is for everyone, regardless of who they are.